Are you ready to embrace the darkness within? Today, we're going to talk about using shadows to bring your minis to the next level. A lot of times in the hobby we focus on the highlights, things like pre-shading and zenithal highlights, but today we're going to look at the opposite. What can we do with darkness to bring our minis to the next level? Alright, so before we can talk about the new, we should talk about the familiar. A lot of us know what zenithal highlighting is. That's where you use an airbrush, spray can, or even a dry brush to give your model the appearance that a diffuse light is hitting it from above. If we look at something like this little termagant here, you can see pretty clearly that there is no defined light source. The light is coming from all around it. Everything is evenly lit and evenly highlighted. We use zenithal highlighting a lot for tabletop models because it provides us something that matches the lighting situation most rooms have. While matching the room lighting is good and does a lot to make models quick to paint up for the tabletop, it doesn't do a lot to add in visual interest. If we look again at our termagant here, it's still fairly uniform. Things stand out, but nothing stands out as much as it could. If we painted in more deliberate highlights, we can bring the focus of the model to specific points, but that adds time. And when you have to paint up 20 termagants, it's not necessarily something you want to do. Here's another example of a zenithal highlight, this Drukhari wedge. You can see on top of a normal zenithal, this has some area, like the chest armor, picked out a little bit more to bring some more focus to standout points of the model. Typically, I'll do this with things like standout pieces of the armor, or, as in this model, the side of the face. Reinforcing the highlights like we've done on this model helps to bring more visual interest to the overall scheme, but we can still push the contrast more by exploring the shadows. As you can see here, everything on the model is rendered evenly. The details on the back, those pouches, the back armor plates, are just as clear as the details on the front, even if they're not as sharply highlighted. Now let's take a look at a model where the entire model is not rendered equally. Looking at this heavy intercessor, you immediately get a feeling for where the light is coming from. There is a strong sense of a front-facing light illuminating the brightest parts of the model. In order to get this vibrant look in those parts, we've had to take down the lighting and increase the shadow in other parts. Looking at the sides of the body, the back of the gun, most of the right side of the model, these are all things that will be painted as being in shadow. They'll be rendered with less detail. And that difference between painting a large amount of fine detail and slightly obscuring parts of the model by rendering less of the detail adds to the overall contrast of the figure. The previous heavy intercessor was just shown with its pre-shading. Let's take a look at one that had the same method but is now finished. This model has a clear sense of lighting coming from one side. The right side of the model is being lit brightly, while the left side is being pushed into shadow. The back side of this model also has many details left minimal if not unrendered. And what this does for us is give a very vibrant look to part of the model. And that general contrast, to me, makes this stand out and look more interesting on the tabletop. Another benefit of this style of painting is that we can choose to focus our attention on the things that will be seen most. By focusing just on these highlighted areas, we can make sure that we spend times on great blends, fine detailing, high contrast paint jobs that don't take ages because we're not doing the entire model to that standard. The last model had a very specific light source, but we can still achieve a similar effect with a broader light source while keeping parts of the model in shadow. Take a look at this Ranger. From this side, the Ranger is well illuminated. You can see strong highlights, and even on the basing, you can see where the leaves gain color, but as we go back, as we look under him, you can see that the basing fades towards desaturated greens. And on the back, you can see how all the saturation of the color goes away into shadow. While we have a strong light source here, it's not necessarily targeted. We can still have a large, somewhat diffuse light shining from the front while obscuring the back of the model. But if you wanted to take the same idea and tone it back a little bit more to keep more of a tabletop vibe, we can do something like this. As you can see here, there is some shadow coming up from underneath, and the back of the model is cast more into shadow than the front, but it's still what I would consider a diffuse light. So how do we achieve this look? As I've shown here, using a pre-shade can be a very helpful part of this process. By taking our airbrush and first highlighting the areas of our brightest light, such as in this model, the head, the kneecap, and the bolter, we can use that to make ourselves a guide of where the light is coming from, and then as we reinforce that lighting, those areas we picked out will continue to stay the brightest as more layers of paint get added on top of them. I do this part of the process with an airbrush, but you could very easily do it by hand. If blending is not something you want to spend time on, potentially using black and white oil paints to establish your gradients quickly. The only thing I don't recommend in this case specifically is dry brushing, because what we're looking for is a relatively specific and targeted application of the highlights, and by dry brushing, you're not going to get that. So we've laid in our pre-shade, and we've picked out our highlights, and we've made sure that when we do the pre-shade, we leave some of the model in complete shadow, simply by not spraying over it, or by spraying over it lightly. So what do we do next? Well, we need to add in some color. Here is a Terminator model that I have started to paint. All this has done so far is the black to white pre-shade, the base tone, a highlight, and the shadow tone. Looking at it from this angle, we get a sense of a very diffuse light with some strong highlights. What looking at from this angle doesn't show us is the shadows on the back. By dropping the back of this model almost entirely into shadow, we really enforce the vibrancy of the highlights on the front. One thing that really helps us with this effect is that we have a universal shadow color. This is petroleum gray from scale 75, and on any part of the model, except for non-metallic metal bits, we will be using this as the shadow tone, and this will be one of our darkest tones. Non-metallic metal needs to go a bit further, so we'll push that down to black. Here's another example of a Terminator with the same logic behind it, but that's slightly more finished. So you can see here, the non-metallic metal on the gun goes down to black and uses slightly different colors. The overall highlighting scheme remains the same as the previous model. The brightest highlights have been enforced through our airbrush pre-shade, and a lot of the model has still been left into shadow. And what this has done again is allow me to focus all of my attention onto the pretty parts of this model, to bring out details in the face, the aquila, to do non-metallic metal on things like the minigun and all of the little bits and bobs. Those things take time, and to do that across the entire model, across an entire army, would mean that I never actually get to play the game. But what it also does is allow me to really make my highlights stand out. By having the model be in darkness, the brightness stands out so much more. And I think that really stands out on a mini like this that's a bone color, or a white color. The white looks so vibrant. No one would look at this mini and think it's not white. No one would look at this gray tone on the back and think the mini's gray, because the white stands out so much. And last, but by no means least, we have big chonking models like this Dreadnought. What sells the image of a giant armored warwalker more than casting a shadow? If we look at this from the front on, we want it to read like it's a big, intimidating piece of metal charging towards you. And the way we do that is by accenting the shadows. You can see here that the back leg is almost completely in shadow, as is the undercarriage. And by doing that, by making those points look darker, it emphasizes the volumes and size of the model itself. This is a great way to add an extra dimension to anything large you're painting. And the bigger the model is, the easier it is to get that kind of control with your airbrush, to spray in more precise shadows, to drop an entire leg into shadow. I hope that this video has given you some things to think about your use of shadows in your miniatures. A lot of times we spend all of our time thinking about highlights, and the shadows can be left out. But I hope that this showed you that they can be just as interesting and integral to your minis as the highlights are. Thanks. Please let me know what you thought in the comments, and let me know if you try this method yourself. This has been Trismegistus Minis, and I hope to see you all again soon.